Narcissism is on the rise, or so it seems, and our communities are and will continue to be harmed by it, even with the protections that our faith should give us. Narcissism is a particularly destructive set of personality traits which can ruin your life and even your faith, whether you are the narcissist or the recipient of narcissistic behaviour. In this video, I will outline what narcissism is, its main forms, and then discuss this in context applicable to a Muslim community. So first, what is narcissism? Narcissism is a collection of personality traits included but not limited to the description of narcissistic personality disorder, which is a recognised disorder requiring treatment. The 9 criteria of narcissistic personality disorder are the following traits. Number 1, a grandiose self of self-importance. Number 2, fantasies of success, power and the ideal love. Number 3, a feeling of being special or particularly unique. Number 4, requiring excessive admiration. Number 5, having a very high sense of entitlement. Number 6, manipulative with others. Number 7, lacking empathy for others. Number 8, often envious and believes people to be envious of them. And number 9, arrogant or condescending attitudes or behaviours. Of these 9 criteria, 5 are needed for a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. And people with this full-blown disorder are rather rare, maybe 1% of the population. But many people who can still be referred to as narcissists have subclinical levels of narcissism. So they have some of these traits, but they don't necessarily meet the full diagnosis. Of course, looking at these traits, it is obvious that these behaviours or behaviours stemming from these are completely contrary to what Islam teaches us. The virtue of modesty and humility is repeated with such frequency throughout our tradition, it is practically like a drumbeat in the Quran and the prophetic teachings. This, of course, does not make individual Muslims immune from narcissism or prevent them from even putting an Islamic spin, justification or defence on their narcissistic behaviour. So before I talk about examples of Muslim narcissism, which of course should be a contradiction in terms but in practice isn't always, I should point out that even though there is only one narcissistic personality disorder, there are broadly speaking 2 types of narcissists. These are grandiose and vulnerable narcissists. So grandiose narcissism resembles the description of narcissistic personality disorder rather well. Grandiose narcissists tend to be socially bold, very optimistic and indifferent to criticism. Vulnerable narcissists, however, tend to be much more introverted, pessimistic and hypersensitive to criticism. Both of these types of narcissism typically have components of very low agreeableness, anger, manipulation and hostility towards others. And a person can also alternate between these 2 types of narcissism, or for that matter have traits from both. So how common is narcissism in Muslim circles? We have a way of life which should impede people from having narcissistic urges or feelings, or at least restrain behaviours that such urges could give rise to. But of course in practice, some Muslims simply don't take their faith seriously. But there are also many people who are ostensibly firm believers, of all groups for that matter, who will find justifications or defences for flagrantly violating the principles of their belief system, and we are of course no exception. So I will now be talking about how narcissistic behaviours can manifest themselves both in a general way and others in a context more specific to a Muslim community. I should say though that most people at some point in their lives, because none of us are perfect, have shown some of these behaviours, so this is not a tool for us to diagnose or confront people, but it is there so we can be aware and help create a compassionate community, but one which doesn't have room for these negative behaviours to flourish. So let's have a look at some typical narcissistic behaviours. Behaviour number 1 is outright lying, whether to raise oneself or defend oneself, for example about achievements or wealth, or to put somebody else down. For a narcissist it's the same thing, the relative difference between putting yourself up and putting somebody else down, it really comes down to the same thing for the narcissist. Now you might wonder, how can somebody who claims to fear God lie? And lie flagrantly? What you need to realise is that even if the narcissist would be inclined to feel some guilt or fear, the truth is often far more offensive than these feelings. Here's an example. Let's say a Muslim has had a a less than clean youth as far as substances and relationships were concerned. Now, many people would keep this quiet, or if put under pressure, maybe they'd admit it, maybe they'd deny it. But what they wouldn't do is proactively go and tell others how they never touched a drink, or they never held somebody's hand outside marriage. But a narcissist would if it meant gaining admiration or respect for their virtuous behaviour. Narcissists can also escape from feeling guilty from lying because they believe in a sense they aren't truly lying. A narcissist is not typically deluded in the literal sense of the word, but they're telling things as they believe they should be. So, in a sense, by lying, they are actually righting a wrong. Here's another possible example. When I was at university, I got a grade lower than the one that I wanted. And I also genuinely thought that there was some injustice, without going into detail, that there was some injustice in the process, which led to me getting this. But of course, if somebody asks for my degree grade, I will tell them the truth, even if I could get away with lying. For a narcissist, however, lying about this would present little problem. They would consider it to be telling the truth as the truth should have been. So number 2, getting admiration, and remember, an intense desire for admiration is one of the criteria of narcissism. By taking credit for somebody else's work, or allowing other people to believe that you were responsible, and I'm afraid to say I have seen flagrant examples of this, whether in the workplace or even at Islamic charity events, for example. So claims like this are awkward and difficult to deny. Sometimes a person who has had their credit usurped by the narcissist doesn't even know, at least until it's too late. And then they would seem like the bad person if they tell others that they were actually responsible for raising the funding or organising the event, etc. And it can generally just be difficult to call other people out for lying or embellishing. Behaviour number 3, refusal to take responsibility for one's own actions. This is an incredibly common trait amongst narcissistic individuals in the workplace and in personal life. So let's say if there's a project, it could be in the workplace, again it could be some sort of Islamic community project, which don't always have the best reputation for efficiency and integrity, I have to admit. So if they were an instrumental part of such a project and the project fails, it was of course somebody else's fault. If they gave, let's say, awful advice that was followed by somebody else and led to failure, it was still that other person's fault, and so forth. If the narcissist didn't give advice, perhaps, or withheld that might have helped the venture, then they can of course claim that they actually did so, but they were ignored, etc. If only everybody had followed their advice. Behaviour number 4, superficial and manipulative charm, which often recruits flying monkeys. The term flying monkeys is a pop psychology term which refers to narcissistic agents, in other words, people who wittingly or unwittingly do the narcissist's bidding. So they can tell other people how great they are, they can harass the victims of the narcissist, they can spread rumours on behalf or testify on behalf of the narcissist as well. The superficial charm feature is often associated with the more optimistic, socially bold, grandiose narcissism, so they can tell great stories, they can be the life and soul of a party, they can have a significant number of people believing that they are helpful, pro-social, that they can be trusted. So now it's a lot harder for other people who have difficulties with them to be believed. Vulnerable narcissists can also show a different type of charm in the form of someone coming across as very misunderstood, very victimised, often very romantic, somebody who needs to be saved by the ideal love. Behaviour number 5, have fantasies about success, power and the ideal love. Again, one of the criteria of narcissistic personality disorder. Now, I think a lot of people have some of these on some level, but with a narcissist it will be a lot more frequent, it will be a lot more intense, and it will involve a lot more admiration being directed at them. I think a lot of people actually do have many pro-social fantasies, and by fantasy I really mean fondly imagining certain situations that are unlikely to actually happen. So, for example, saving somebody. But with most people, it would be the deed rather than the admiration afterwards, but not so much with the narcissist. Behaviour number 6, a very common one, exaggerating their intimacy or knowledge of high status people, or being close to people who they consider being high status. So again, a very common one. So there'll be a close friend of the organiser or CEO of a charity event, for example, or an Islamic spokesperson, or a high profile guest, or even just random celebrities. Number 7, they will use religion to justify their selfishness. So hadith spamming to a spouse, for example, to emotionally blackmail them into giving them more physical intimacy, or for them to go out and get a job that pays more, for example. And this kind of emotional blackmailing, we often associate it with coming from men, particularly if it regards physical intimacy, for example. So claiming that the angels will curse their wife if they don't give them satisfaction. But it can certainly come from women too. So for example, Islamically, you should provide, right, as a front to basically bully their spouse or would-be spouse into doing a job or a course that would bring in the money to let her live her princess lifestyle, for example. Number 8, they will regard any sort of disagreement or scrutiny as a personal attack. So if you inquire about what they have actually done in a particular job or role, you're simply trying to pick fault with them. If, say, you point out, however objectively, that a task which was theirs to complete or a duty that was theirs to fulfill hasn't been done, they'll say that you're being rude or that you're attacking them, or maybe they'll come up with a grievance against you rather than take responsibility. Behaviour number 9 is vengefulness, more associated with vulnerable narcissism, and in more conservative societies, potentially very, very destructive. Examples include spreading revenge porn, so to speak, so illicit photos from broken down relationships, slander, rumour spreading, but quite often under the guise of righting an injustice. So another one would be public humiliation and abuse. So having an outburst against your spouse in public. And I have to say, actually, this one, maybe even more so than some of the even worse behaviours in this list, really does make me feel rather sick. I mean, thank God, this is never something that I've been subjected to, but I do know of people who have, and I don't know, again, there can be worse forms of abuse, but I struggle to think of many. I mean, I'm trying to be fairly objective and detached over here, but if you have shouted at your spouse or relation in public, I truly believe that you have a disease in your heart. You are truly an abuser, and both yourself and your partner need help. I don't care what injustice you think you are somehow correcting. Chances are that other individual is better off without you. And now guess what? You've allowed the perception of Muslims to sink even lower than it currently might be. But an injustice was done to me. Sure. Number 10, infidelity. Of course, everybody knows that Islam is rather strict about this, but marital and premarital unfaithfulness still happens. So premarital unfaithfulness could be considering other people to marry when the impression has clearly been given or clearly stated to a potential partner that you are now committed to one another. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with considering several people for marriage at once, but only if you are open about it to each person. Of course, as well, some Muslims do have quote-unquote normal relationships by Western standards, which do include physical relations and cohabitation, and those can of course include cheating. Marital unfaithfulness can include affairs, which the narcissist can blame for the spouse for pushing them into doing it by not being a good enough spouse, for example, and also polygamy. Yes, polygamy is not haram. There are some historically justifiable circumstances for it. So, for example, if there are far fewer men due to war than women, for instance, well, somebody needs to look after the women and the children, and especially if there's no welfare system or anything like that. However, in most marriages now, there is an unspoken or spoken understanding that the marriage will remain monogamous. So if a man goes overseas, let's say, to find a spouse, leaving his distressed wife at home, he's still a cheat, pure and simple. Number 11 would be arrogant and condescending behaviour. So for all of the, warnings Islam gives regarding acquiring flashy material goods, that doesn't stop a large segment of the community being obsessed with acquiring them and showing them off, and even in some cases implying in no uncertain terms that the other people subjected to the showing off would struggle to acquire the money needed to purchase said items or property. I won't go much further with this one, or I'll seem like I'm narrowing it down too much. Behaviour number 12 would be violence. Both vulnerable and grandiose narcissism have a sense of entitlement that comes with it and can give rise to violence. And unfortunately, we do see some examples of this in the Muslim community. Like all communities, domestic violence exists, but one of the greatest tragedies of our community is the presence of some truly malignant so-called teachers whose aggression, cruelty and sadism towards young children has made them hate the mosque and in some cases even the faith itself. Regarding relationships or marital relationships, abuse, both physical and otherwise, is strongly linked to narcissism too. A narcissist is very prone to think that somebody should suffer for any slights or grievances against them, whether real or imagined. Behaviour number 13, the mindset that nothing is bigger than their own problems. People have problems in life, sometimes huge problems which, thank God, I have never had to face, and frankly, I don't know if I could. And it is natural to discuss these, sometimes to find solutions, sometimes just for an offload, sometimes because you genuinely need empathy and sympathy, sometimes because you don't have anything else to talk about. And none of that is narcissism. Where this changes is where the person can't or isn't interested in talking about anything other than their problems. And again, this is more associated with vulnerable narcissism rather than grandiose. So how injustice is always done to them, how it's not fair, why is God treating them like this, etc. Behaviour number 14, they are never wrong. So in personal disputes, for example, narcissists, again, they're never wrong. So if they said something which was cruel and slanderous, either they never said it, or if they really can't deny it, they were correcting an injustice, again, common theme here, or the other person made them say this cruel thought or outburst, for example. So, for example, yes, I called your sister or mother or whatever an obscenity, but you made me say it. And if you're a narcissist, you can ramp this up as well and say, wallahi, or I swear, or something similar when you're talking about a dubious claim, because now the other person feels a lot more apprehensive about denying what you're saying, because they don't want to say that somebody who has sworn such a deep oath is wrong. Okay, so behaviour number 15, the need for admiration and likes in whatever sense. So one really unfortunate example of this that I witnessed was a Islamic dawah carrier, I guess you could say, running up to a known non-Muslim and Islamophobe and just arguing with them on the street. So getting their 5 minutes of fame and likes, but actually doing Islam so much damage. And yeah, a while ago somebody did this with a very high-profile Islamophobe. I won't name either, though the Islamophobe, not noted for his scholarly intelligence, had still read enough anti-Islam material to know that according to some sources, the beloved Prophet, upon whom be peace, God forgive me for even repeating this, raped one of his wives after killing, I believe, her husband and father. So what was this Muslim's response? So what? Great. You've had your 5 minutes of fame and now tens of thousands of people think that the beloved prophet upon whom be peace was literally a rapist. For an explanation clearly refuting this, by the way, see the link in the description. Behaviour number 16, ostentatious pro-social behaviour. True, narcissists usually believe that they come before others, but as we've seen, one component of narcissism is admiration, and pro-social behaviour can often achieve that. And in fact, many narcissistic fantasies are actually pro-social ones. So in the case of vulnerable narcissism, it's often about their redemption. You know, finally, everyone sees how good I really am. Everyone who never appreciated me or cared now realises how great I am, and they feel sorry. Grandiose narcissists as well, they just want to be admired more and more. Now, I do feel a little bit uncomfortable discussing this one because I don't want people to think that I'm disparaging the achievements and kindness of people who, let's say, volunteer abroad and, say, post pictures of it for other people to see. That is not narcissism in itself at all. But I will just say that it can be a means for narcissists to get, again, likes and attention. Or rather, pro-social behaviour, so helping others, does not mean that somebody is not also a narcissist, particularly if it's being done very ostentatiously. Behaviour number 17, they always see purposeful injustice done against them. Narcissists rarely admit to wrongdoing, but in situations where it is literally unavoidable, they'll insist that anyone else in the situation would have done the same, and that their own intentions were not bad. But of course, they won't make the same excuses for anybody who slights them. So if the narcissist hurt somebody else's feelings, it was unintentional, the other person was oversensitive, or they can give a rather hollow apology, I'm sorry you feel this way, and this apology must be accepted. If the narcissist is on the receiving end of a slight, real or imagined, well, in that case, it was intentional, it was cruel, it was malicious, it was meant to harm, and no apology is likely to be good enough, and an act done in vengeance or holding a grudge, that is justified. So, behaviour number 18, we have alluded to this before, but it deserves its own section. And this is that the narcissist has a real phobia for apologising. So often they just won't apologise, even when it's clear that they should, or if they do, they'll expect instant forgiveness. So a typical apology might look like something like, as I said before, I'm sorry you feel that way, or sometimes it'll be, alright, I'm sorry, okay? So again, quite an aggressive sorry that doesn't really contain any remorse, or I'm sorry but, followed by something which really negates the apology. And even these really insincere statements, a narcissist will typically consider particularly concessionary on their part, and therefore you will be absolutely obliged to accept the apology. Not only that, but you will be obliged to accept any criticism of you that the narcissist has included in the apology as well. Behaviour number 19, will fight dirty, will bring up things from the past, but of course accuse others of being vengeful if they point out the behaviour patterns of the narcissist. Narcissists are often quite good at winning arguments, or seeming to win arguments, and a big reason for this is that they can always go one step further than you can. So they can swear deeper oaths, they can say much more vicious and unforgivable things, which quite often you made them say, by the way, according to them. They can fight dirty, so a narcissistic husband could bring the mother-in-law into the argument, even though it's not relevant. So, you're becoming a real such and such, like your mother, for example. And of course, they can often tell their own truths, which they believe should be the truth, but of course, which often diverges from actual events. Behaviour or quality number 20 is that they suffer a lot. Though often they will not internalise that their personality is at least partly to blame. You see, a cold comfort of many of the victims of narcissism is that narcissists themselves suffer. Vulnerable ones more ostensibly so, but probably both. Narcissists often lose friends or fail to make them, they have higher rates of divorce, and they also have a fragile ego and are often rather insecure. However, they don't usually admit, even to themselves, that their personality is at all to blame. So it's rare that somebody, let's say, goes into counselling because they're worried about their narcissism. Narcissists are actually a lot more likely to find themselves in counselling because of other problems such as depression, for instance. Now, as I have said before, this list is not provided in any way for us to go and confront or diagnose people. Again, what I want to do is to help us create this compassionate community which is still firm but fair and does not leave room for these negative behaviours to flourish. So I hope that you have enjoyed this video. May God protect us and our loved ones and humanity from arrogance and other diseases of the heart. If you enjoyed this video, please like, leave a comment and consider subscribing to my channel.